Oh, never mind what has been happening in South Africa in the last 24 hours with a budget just passed in the National Assembly, or at least the fiscal framework. There's lots of else to happen with the budget, lots of bills, etc. But globally, in the last 24 hours, we have had US President Donald Trump announce universal and reciprocal tariffs on over 60 countries, many of whom traditional US allies, trading partners, and many other countries contained in that list, including, of course, South Africa. So, joining me to discuss what has happened in the last 24 hours to try and make some sense of it. It's an easy topic for him to try and figure out for us, but he is the CEO of the XA International Trade Advisors, Mr. Donald MacKay. Donald, thanks very much for joining us today. As I said, a lot to try and unpack, but I think let's start with just the basics before we get into the merits or demerits of what has been going on. So, yeah, we've got a 10% universal tariff on imports into the US, and then various levels of other reciprocal tariffs on imports into the US. This has been coming, right, for a while. So just give us some of that background in terms of President Trump and his advisors, in terms of how they think about global trade, and what could help us understand some of their reasoning here.
Yeah, good evening, Chris. I think they appear to view global trade as some kind of zero-sum game. So if you're importing, the story is that's bad. If you're exporting, it's good. And so because of this very kind of moralistic view on all of this, the conclusion is that trade deficits are bad for your country. And so they've taken exception to it. Now, they seem to think that when you're importing something, you're taking something away from your domestic economy. And so if you reduce those imports and you get people to make it at home, then what will happen is you'll be better off. More people will have jobs. All those people will earn a lot more money. And on paper, that sounds fine. South Africa, for quite a long time, had a similar philosophy. But the economics of that simply doesn't work. And so what Trump is doing has been tried before. He's certainly not the first person to go down this road. And it has failed just about every other time I can think of. I have no reason to think it works this time.
Donald, this might be from an analysis point of view on my part, but we could go one of two routes here. So either this is the start of a sort of global tit-for-tat tariff war and escalation. So other countries double down, they increase their own tariffs on US exports to their countries or imports into those countries, and then maybe they form more regional blocks, etc. So that's your negative route, impacting negatively on global growth, increasing costs, keeping inflation high, etc. On the other hand, perhaps the sort of wave of trade liberalization. So other countries lower their own tariffs in the hope that the US will then lower its tariffs, its reciprocal tariffs on them. Please poke holes in those two scenarios, because I do say that is a bit reductionist. Do you think broadly that's where the world is at this point in time, sort of the fork in the road?
Yeah, so I think actually you're quite right, but let me maybe add a little bit of color to what you've described. So the deglobalization, last night just started, and we of course don't know how different regions are going to react. But I think we must split the world perhaps into larger economies and smaller economies. We're in the latter, to be clear, should anyone from government be listening. So the larger economies have a little more leeway to retaliate. But the smaller and the more fragile your economy is, the harder such retaliation would practically be. So, but retaliation will happen. The other thing that is already happening is reorganizing alliances. So remember, we're coming at this really just from a trade perspective. But imagine you're in Europe and you've got NATO, and you've got President Trump saying, we don't really care if you get invaded by Russia. We're not going to step up and do anything. In fact, he even said to Putin, you should sort of focus on the countries that haven't paid their dues. So the importance of an alliance goes beyond just trade in those regions. And so we already see Canada pulling a lot closer to Europe. We see China trying to step into the role. And logically, you're taking the world's largest economy, is isolating itself from the rest of the world. The rest of the world can't be passive and just hope that Trump changes his mind. And so I think the realignment is going to happen. I think even if Trump stepped down tomorrow, that would continue. I don't think you get to stop this any longer. And so I don't know how that plays out. Well, a part of this reorganizing will probably be more trade deals between regions that may not have had, or deepening trade deals. I was in a meeting earlier today, and the people in the meeting were saying, look, maybe we need to start looking at other regions like Mercosur in South America. Let's expand that agreement and try to do more. So versions of that will happen. What I don't think will happen, and I've advocated for a trade agreement with the US for probably a decade. I don't think that's a good idea at the moment. I think you're dealing with an untrustworthy interlocutor on the other side. Trump has breached every trade agreement he has last night. The few that he didn't, with USMCA being breached, he's now just taken out all of them, South Korea, etc. And these are incredibly close allies to the US. So I don't think a trade agreement gets you anywhere, because you could have the agreement today and tomorrow he changes his mind. I think South Africa is going to have to simply start reducing its exposure to the US, create more of a portfolio like you would in your personal savings, the same sort of thing. Yeah.
Donald, on that point around maybe retaliating or trying to find alternative measures. So you've already had the Secretary of State, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. One of the quotes in the last 24 hours, he said, "My advice to every country right now is do not retaliate. Sit back, take it in. Let's see how it goes. Because if you retaliate, there will be escalation. If you don't retaliate, this is the high water mark," end quotes. And I think this is part of the negotiating, right? And the sort of style that this administration brings to the table, where they set the precedent up to this high level, and then they want to see how other countries and regions react. But that maybe doesn't take into consideration that there are domestic politics and regional politics at play for these different countries. It's not just the case of they're only trading with the US or they're only dealing with those economic interests. They have to deal with their own internal matters. So I think I don't know, maybe this is being sort of engaging in hyperbole on my part, but this could open a bit of a Pandora's box, right?
Well, so I saw the comment, and I think it's a ridiculous comment. They're having the conversation with the wrong person. They need to talk to Trump, who's throwing the first punch. There are areas like South Africa where trade is an important part of our life, but the US is about 9% of our exports. It's not nothing, to be clear. But there are other regions. If you're Canada, this is a big deal. And what are you meant to do? Or Europe is another one, or South Korea. So you don't have an option to simply roll over. The other problem is you can't have a relationship with a country where the country kind of hits you at the back of the head as hard as they can, and then they say, just don't do anything, and we'll decide what to do. So if Trump does not get addressed in some way like any bully, the problem, I think, simply persists. So that worries me a little bit. Again, I don't think South Africa should be the one to be throwing the big punches here. But there are big regions. I can't imagine that they do nothing. And of course, you raise a very good point. If you're in Europe, you not only have had to deal with Trump, you've had to deal with the very dodgy Signal chat, where they're basically shit talking your region and say, like, well, I don't know what, how are we going to extract some money for Europe if we're going to do anything here? So clearly your population is not going to be ecstatic if you just roll over here.
Donald, talking about some of those more traditional US allies that have now been hit with higher tariffs, and if you talk about US geostrategic interests, you would the easy caricature of America first, of the sort of new philosophy of the US, is that that's completely isolationist. I've read it a little bit as it doesn't necessarily mean America alone, where I thought they would try and focus on some regions and really sort of focus on the upcoming and ongoing battle with a country like China, for example. But they would try and work with regional partners, try and strengthen trade and other relationships where they could. But then I look at some of these tariffs. For example, you've got 20% on the EU, 46% on Vietnam, 32% on Taiwan, 24% on Japan, 25% on South Korea, and 10% on the UK. Now, some of those, like Vietnam, I mean, that's vital for US supply chains and value chains. So I'm wondering, is there something I'm missing in that regard?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
There's nothing rational here, Chris, and Trump seems to think that there kind of many versions of economics that can work, and his version can work just as well as anyone else's. The problem is humans don't change no matter what your theories are. What he is doing, is not going to end well, and I'm somewhat alarmed that his advisors are not screaming a little bit louder to say this ends poorly.
When we talk about trade, sort of trade policy and trade economics and economics more broadly, part of the statement that the White House released yesterday, and I quote, "The numbers for tariffs by country have been calculated by the Council of Economic Advisors based on the concept that the trade deficit that we have with any given country is the sum of all trade practices, the sum of all cheating," end quote, which is what a White House official said, calling it, quote unquote, the most fair thing in the world. Tell us just a little bit about trade deficits. Why is it a bad thing or not? Because this is a big narrative point for the administration, where they see any trade deficit that the US has as an incredibly negative thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps telling that for the countries where they have a surplus, they still put a 10% on. So it's, the US seems to think that the only outcome that works is the US with a surplus with the rest of the world, and everyone else, just buying US stuff. Well, it doesn't work that way. So there are a couple of reasons why. Trade deficits, if they persist for long periods, in many countries can pose a problem. But we must understand a little bit better what happens in the US. I mean, if you look at African states, they very often persist with trade deficits, and and then suddenly they run out of dollars or whatever the case might be. The US is in a slightly different position. Firstly, because the US doesn't trade in any other currency, so they're only ever trading in their home currency, which removes all the volatility and other risks out of it. The same money that you buy abroad is the same money you use at home. Well, why is that? It's because of the idea of this reserve currency. And even though the reserve currency was a planned concept, the reserve currency in practice requires people to trust in the dollar. And so people trade in the dollar because there's always enough dollars around. Why are there enough dollars around? Well, because the US imports a lot, and a lot of their dollars go out. And that keeps fairly stable. So the US is putting out more dollars into the world than they would need within their home market. And that is because they buy more. So if you're gonna strip away the trade deficit in the US, my view is that you also place at risk, significant risk, your reserve currency status. Now, Trump seems to want both. He's threatened people who move off the dollar that he's going to put huge duties on. I forget how much, but he's threatened BRICS, for example. But the point is, how can you remain on the dollar if the US is not putting dollars into the global market? And China, I don't think is a great replacement for the dollar, but the euro might be better. We're already seeing a slow shift as people try to de-risk. So that becomes a problem. The other issue is the US, a far bigger problem in the US is their budgetary deficit. So the US is spending money like a drunk man in a strip club at the moment. So that's a far bigger problem. And what has happened with this tariff increase is effectively an enormous tax on consumption in America. and consumption is the biggest driver of the US GDP growth. And so I think Trump will get exactly what he wants, which is a reduced deficit or possibly even a surplus. But the price for that will be a smaller American economy.
Donald, if we focus in now on South Africa specifically, so you talked about, there will be talk of some sort of new bilateral or other trade agreement between South Africa and the US. We can get into some more details around that. But I mean, talking about something like AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, of which South Africa is a beneficiary, it does come up for renewal later this year in the third quarter. I mean, given previous executive orders, my view was that South Africa's AGOA participation is now at an end. These new tariffs, do they supersede and override AGOA and other maybe agreements that South Africa has with the US?
I believe so. I mean, my view, I recorded a short video last night on this, and I said, I think last night AGOA ended. It doesn't matter what is said officially, but I think that was the end of it. AGOA, by the way, gives us a benefit of around 3.5%, Chris. So,
right.
Yeah. It's gone.
And then talking about immediate economic impact to specific sectors. So, I mean, the ones that jump to mind are things like automotive, agriculture. But with that said, overnight, the White House published a list of products that are exempt from these universal tariffs. So you've got platinum group metals. And in that regard, mining commodities represent more than half of South African exports to the US. However, agricultural products aren't exempted on the list of exemptions. So we talk about citrus for South Africa, wine that we export to the US, the automotive point. So which is it clear yet to you, and it might not be to anyone, maybe even not to officials in the White House, which sectors are exempt and which aren't?
Yeah, so the minerals never made sense, and we're happy to see that they've been excluded. We have some people working on analysis of all of this right now. And just a quick punt, we're having a webinar next Wednesday to break down all the data, which of course I'll share with you. So the sector that's going to take, I think, the hardest hit is, out of doubt, going to be automotive. And the impact there, I think, will be very, very fast, by which I mean within months. I don't mean within days. But a couple of things are going to happen here. There's stock on the water at the moment, and that stock's going to arrive in the US. And contrary to what President Trump keeps saying in the media, those tariffs are going to be paid by Americans when the product arrives. And so a car, which was going to, a $1 million car that arrives in the US, that was going to pay no duty, is now going to have a 300,000 Rand or 250,000. Sorry, the autos are 25%. So you get a 25% tariff. And, well, they can't really do anything about the stock that's coming in now, but that stock's more expensive. US cars in countries with lower tariffs, their vehicles will start to dominate. And South Africa's already not naturally a cost-competitive manufacturer of cars. So I think auto will hit hard, and because cars are, you don't sort of walk into the dealership and then you pick your car and you drive off with it. Cars are almost a bespoke thing. You say, I want a sunroof and I want this. The car's kind of almost built to order. And I think that order book dries up very quickly compared to the stock. So, the minute they run out of stock in the US and they wanted to place more, they're going to look at it and they're going to say, well, the BMW X3 plug-in hybrid is now about to get very expensive, and people will start to shift, I would think, to other cars. I think it's going to be terrible.
And then maybe your second in line in terms of impact, I'm guessing agriculture, maybe some manufacturing.
Yeah, so aluminium is a big one. We exported unwrought aluminium, which is kind of billets and that sort of stuff, out of Richards Bay. So I assume that's South 32. We exported about 8 billion last year. That's the second in line after auto. Agriculture, I think socially is probably going to have the worst impact. It's not that big a part of the basket, but it's very labor intensive, and it's labor intensive in very poor parts of the country. So yes, citrus, table grapes, wine, these sorts of things, not good. The very capital intensive stuff will take a hit, but the social impact of that will be smaller. Of course, the problem with cars particularly is you've got a long supply chain behind you. So every component manufacturer is also facing a problem. So, I think those the two car companies being hit, Mercedes-Benz and BMW. East London has Mercedes-Benz as their anchor tenant. It's not good.
For those companies, if you were sitting in those boardrooms now, either in South Africa or in Europe, I mean, what's step one tomorrow? I wish these conversations had been happening sooner, because I think this was very much a scenario that should have been planned for and gamed for. It doesn't help wishing that things were different, but what should be first on the agenda tomorrow morning's board meeting?
Yeah, I would suspect by now they've activated their lobbyists in DC. So we know the auto industry was trying to stop this. I think the problem we have here is President Trump truly believes that what he's doing is going to work. I don't think it's a political play. And he seems to think, everyone must calm down. Yes, we're going to go through a bit of pain, and then we're all just going to arrive in utopia, and it's all going to be good. And so the car companies, the problem has got to get fixed in the US. The problem can't be fixed in Germany or Japan. The US has to fix this. And I've got to think the automotive industry, which is an enormous industry in the US, has got to have a very powerful lobby. And I'm hoping that they can talk sense into the president's head.
Donald, going back to the sort of medium level, so macro is between country and country, and medium maybe between businesses, and just what maybe other players can do here. So you talked earlier a little bit about why South Africa shouldn't necessarily jump at this new bilateral and mutually beneficial trade agreement idea. Something like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Do you think does something like what has happened now really speed up the sort of operationalization of the AfCFTA? Like, again, it should have been much further along. We talk a lot about implementation in South Africa and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa with trade policy. But is that sort of regional or continent-wide trade agreement, would that help now in the short to medium term?
So I think what it will do is breathe a lot more energy into the agreement. Africa's coming for a drubbing, I think, incredibly unfairly, but far worse than South Africa. So some countries like Nigeria appear to have the president seems to have ignored them for now. I don't know why, but lots of countries in Africa are going to be in very deep trouble with this. So I think the importance of Africa trading with itself might genuinely receive attention in a way that it hasn't. But the problem is, the Continental Agreement doesn't give Africans buying power overnight. And you could talk all we want about intra-Africa trade, but we're not going to outcompete China in a hurry. And China is now going to have even more surplus product, which is going to be looking for a home. But I agree with that. I'd also argue, though, that we've got to more rapidly escalate proper coherence in Africa, so that Africa can start operating as a bloc rather than as individual states. I've always thought of that as something very far off, but it becomes incredibly important here. If people can move around a little bit more freely, we make it simpler, and we're going to have to stop killing each other. Africa's an unbelievably violent continent, and the conflict has got to drop so that business can proceed. And here the African institutions have a lot to answer for. I mean, they've been incredibly weak. And I think the moment has now arrived where sorting those things out becomes incredibly important. If we don't, the market kind of remains moribund like it always has been. But also there are other regions in the world that want to do more trade with us. So the very unpleasant breakup between Europe and Canada and Mexico and the US, we've got to say, what can we do with those people and their concerns for how the US would react to a lot of that, I would suspect, is gone.
And Donald, just as a very final question, we could cover, I think, days and weeks, if not longer, in terms of the implications here. But we've tried to give just a high-level view of some of the key points, some of the motivation from the White House, the implications for South Africa, etc. Just a final question, maybe from my side, and then I'll let you go. What would be maybe to the presidency the next steps of advice? So, we've had talks of sending an envoy to Washington. We've had talks of sending a business grouping, etc., etc. Is it all of the above? Is it ignoring what's going on? Is it just going to Beijing, for example? What do you think would get the most purchase in the sense of putting South Africa first? So putting South Africa's national interest and economic interest first.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think we need to hurry up and appoint an ambassador. That's a really important job at the moment. And I mentioned in another interview earlier this week that we can't send yet another washed out politician as a ambassador. We need to get somebody who ideally is an experienced diplomat who understands how the game is played. I think that's crucial because this is not a short-term problem. We have Trump for at least another 4 years if he doesn't actually run for a third term. And even when he leaves, we're going to end up with somebody that's not going to walk these policies back in a hurry. So I think a very strong ambassador and an embassy in the US is absolutely crucial. I think before we go running off to the US, there's a moment here where, and perhaps government is doing all of this, I simply don't know. But I would look at the data a lot more carefully. I would spend a day or 2 or 3 or a week even saying, what strategically do we do here? Run those scenarios. If we do this, what happens if we do that? But also map how the world now looks, where those alliances are, where they are different. Europe has been trying to pull closer to South Africa for quite a long time. We haven't been a terribly easy trade partner for them for quite a while. But I think a lot of that can get sorted out. There's a far bigger threat to everyone. And I think, rather than trying to approach this just as South Africa, we need to map out where our alliances are. Trump has been a bit hysterical because Canada and Europe are looking at acting in concert against the US. But there's a reason that trade union strikes, etc., work. There's power in even groups of the less powerful. And I think we've got to think very carefully about that. I guess the fear that I have is we run into the arms of China and BRICS is becoming increasingly large. I don't think it's becoming increasingly effective, but certainly more and more people are pitching up. And that does worry me. I think we must be very careful that we should never forget that we're a democracy, and it's something to be very proud of. And I don't think the partners in BRICS, for the most part, India is a bit of an exception there, Brazil too, but many of those partners are some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. Iran being an obvious one that comes to mind. And I think we must be very careful in our anger towards the US and what President Trump is doing to not align ourselves with some of the world's worst reprobate nations, because I think there's a moral cost you pay for that kind of association, and that does worry me.
I think that's a good note on which to end. Things are more complicated than we obviously wish they were, and try and make sense of them. So Donald, thank you very much for your time this evening. As I said, there is a lot more we can talk about for much longer, but this is important just from a first impressions point of view. Where are the key areas? Where are the key focuses? Where should those be from the private sector? And I think from government. So much appreciated. To all of you who joined us this evening, thank you all very much. The recording will be available, of course, on our YouTube channel. We'll share it accordingly. So thank you all, and I'm sure we'll chat again very soon. Let's see what the next 24 hours has in store for us. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.